The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived with unusual tension in the Atlanta Superior Court. The hallways buzzed with whispers as James Peterson, now wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his usual work clothes, was escorted into courtroom 304. His physical appearance had changed during his weeks in jail. His normally clean-shaven face now showed patches of gray stubble, and his eyes carried dark circles beneath them. What happened next would turn a straightforward hate crime case into a story that would be discussed in law schools for years to come. As Peterson entered the courtroom, he came face to face with Judge Marcus Williams for the first time. The judge, an African-American man in his early 60s with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, sat behind the bench with the kind of calm dignity that came from 25 years of judicial experience. Judge Williams was well known in Atlanta's legal circles. He had earned his law degree from Harvard, served as a prosecutor for a decade, and had been appointed to the bench by a Republican governor. His reputation for fairness was legendary. Defendants of all backgrounds had received equal treatment in his courtroom for over 2 decades. The moment Peterson saw Judge Williams, his face contorted with anger. He immediately turned to his court-appointed attorney, Linda Martinez, and loudly demanded a different judge. The courtroom fell silent as Peterson's voice echoed off the walls. "I won't be judged by one of them," he declared, making no attempt to hide his racism. "I want a white judge. This ain't gonna be fair." Judge Williams remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keyboard, and the bailiff took a step forward, ready to maintain order. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Martinez, clearly embarrassed by her client's outburst, quickly tried to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, I apologize for my client's behavior," she began, but Peterson interrupted her. "I don't want you apologizing for me," he snapped. "I want a white judge, and I got the right to ask for one." Judge Williams finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Mr. Peterson, in my courtroom, every defendant is treated equally under the law. If you have legitimate concerns about my ability to be impartial, you may file a formal motion for recusal through your attorney." Peterson's response was to turn to Martinez and demand she file the motion immediately. Martinez, a veteran defense attorney with 15 years of experience, knew the motion would have no legal merit. However, she was also bound by legal ethics to represent her client's wishes. Over the next few days, Martinez prepared the recusal motion, though she struggled to find any legal basis for it. Peterson's only argument was the judge's race, a reason that had been rejected by higher courts countless times. Still, she submitted the required paperwork, knowing it was her duty to represent her client's wishes, no matter how misguided. The motion created a stir in the legal community. Local newspapers picked up the story, and legal blogs began discussing the case. Some defended Peterson's right to request a different judge, while others saw it as a blatant abuse of the legal system's procedural protections. The Jackson family, who had been present for Peterson's outburst, watched the proceedings with growing concern. Michael Jackson later told reporters, "We trust Judge Williams to be fair." Mr. Peterson's reaction only shows why this case is so important. A hearing was scheduled to address the recusal motion. The courthouse security was increased, as word of the controversial case had drawn both media attention and protesters. Outside the courthouse, small groups gathered holding signs either supporting judicial impartiality or, in a few disturbing cases, expressing sympathy with Peterson's views. Judge Williams took the unusual step of ordering a complete review of his past sentencing records before the recusal hearing. He requested an independent analysis of every case he had presided over in the past 5 years, broken down by the race of the defendants. This thoroughness was characteristic of his approach to justice. As the hearing date approached, legal experts began weighing in on national news programs. Most agreed that Peterson's motion would fail, but many were curious about how Judge Williams would handle such an openly hostile defendant. Would he recuse himself to avoid any appearance of bias? Would he stand his ground? The legal community waited anxiously for his decision. The stage was now set for a crucial moment in the case, one that would test not only the principles of judicial impartiality, but also the ability of the legal system to address racism head-on. The next hearing would prove to be even more dramatic than anyone expected. The recusal hearing began on a tense Monday morning. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including several civil rights attorneys, members of the media, and concerned citizens. Judge Marcus Williams entered the courtroom exactly at 9 a.m., his black robe crisp and his demeanor professional as always. James Peterson sat at the defense table, looking more disheveled than before. His jail time had not softened his attitude. If anything, he seemed more defiant. His attorney, Linda Martinez, had dark circles under her eyes after spending sleepless nights preparing for this unusual hearing. As the proceedings began, Peterson's behavior became increasingly disruptive. When Judge Williams asked him to rise, Peterson remained seated, forcing his attorney to pull him up by his arm. The bailiff moved closer, anticipating trouble. "We're here to address the defense's motion for recusal," Judge Williams began, his voice steady and clear. "Ms. Martinez, you may present your arguments." Before Martinez could speak, Peterson jumped to his feet. "I'll tell you the arguments myself," he shouted, ignoring his attorney's attempts to quiet him. What followed was a 3-minute tirade filled with racial slurs and accusations so offensive that several spectators left the courtroom in disgust. Judge Williams remained remarkably composed throughout Peterson's outburst. He didn't use his gavel or call for order. Instead, he simply watched and listened, his expression neutral but attentive. This unexpected response seemed to fuel Peterson's anger even more. "Your Honor," Martinez finally managed to speak when Peterson paused for breath. "Perhaps we could take a brief recess." But Judge Williams shook his head slowly. "Mr. Peterson appears to have more to say," the judge observed calmly. "Let's allow him to finish." This response caught Peterson off guard. He had expected anger, punishment, or at least irritation. The judge's calm demeanor seemed to confuse him, and his next words came out less forcefully. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, sat at her table, document ready with statistical evidence showing Judge Williams's fair treatment of defendants of all races. But before she could present her arguments, Judge Williams did something unexpected. "Mr. Peterson," he said, leaning forward slightly, "you've made your feelings about my race very clear. Now, I'd like to share something with you." The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Williams began describing his first experience with racism as a child in Georgia, his voice never rising, his tone remaining conversational. He talked about his father, who had taught him that the best response to hatred was not more hatred, but unwavering adherence to justice and truth. As he spoke, Peterson's aggressive stance began to waver. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. The judge's personal story, delivered without anger or accusation, had caught him completely off guard. "Now," Judge Williams continued, "I have here the results of an independent review of every case I presided over in the past 5 years." He held up a thick document. "Would you like to know what it shows, Mr. Peterson?" Peterson, now sitting, gave a slight nod. The statistics were clear. Judge Williams had shown remarkable consistency in his sentencing across all racial groups. In fact, in some categories, white defendants had received slightly more lenient sentences than others, though the differences were statistically insignificant. "The law," Judge Williams explained, "doesn't see color, Mr. Peterson, and neither does justice. Your motion for recusal is denied, not because I'm refusing to step down, but because the law requires judges to be fair to all, and that's exactly what I've always done and will continue to do." The silence in the courtroom was profound. Even Peterson seemed to have run out of words. His attorney, Martinez, looked both relieved and impressed by the judge's handling of the situation. As the hearing concluded, Judge Williams made one final statement. "Mr. Peterson, you have the right to appeal this decision. However, I want you to know that in my courtroom, you'll receive the same fair treatment as any other defendant. Your actions will be judged, not your race, and not your beliefs, no matter how much you may judge others by theirs." The hearing ended, but its impact resonated throughout the courthouse. Legal observers who had witnessed the proceedings immediately began discussing the judge's unusual approach. Instead of meeting hatred with punishment, he had responded with calm transparency and personal dignity. As Peterson was led back to his cell, his usual bravado seemed diminished. For the first time since his arrest, he walked in silence, appearing to be deep in thought. The challenge to Judge Williams had backfired spectacularly, but in a way that no one had anticipated. The days following the failed recusal hearing brought unexpected developments in the Peterson case. Judge Marcus Williams, instead of showing any resentment towards Peterson's racist behavior, took a series of actions that surprised everyone involved in the case. Instead, Judge Williams shared his plans for handling the case. "I've been thinking about Mr. Peterson's accusations," he began, adjusting his reading glasses. "While we've proven my sentencing record is fair, I want to go a step further. I'm ordering a complete transparency protocol for this trial." The judge's plan was unprecedented. He announced that every proceeding would be recorded on video, not just audio as was standard. Additionally, he requested a panel of independent legal observers to monitor the trial. These observers would include retired judges from different racial backgrounds, ensuring that every decision and interaction would be scrutinized for fairness. When word of these measures reached Peterson in his jail cell, his reaction surprised his guards. For the first time since his arrest, he fell silent, appearing to be genuinely confused by the judge's approach. One guard overheard him muttering, "This ain't how it's supposed to go." The media quickly picked up on Judge Williams's unusual strategy. Legal experts appeared on national news shows, discussing the implications. Many praised the judge's innovative approach to addressing racial bias claims head-on, while others worried it might set a complicated precedent for future cases. Meanwhile, Judge Williams took another unexpected step. He ordered a comprehensive review of the court's jury selection process to ensure absolute fairness. He appointed an independent consultant to oversee jury selection, making it clear that both the prosecution and defense would have equal input in the process. The Jackson family, still dealing with the aftermath of Peterson's attack on their property, watched these developments with growing respect for Judge Williams. Michael Jackson told reporters outside the courthouse, "The judge is teaching everyone a lesson in dignity and professionalism. He's showing what true justice looks like." In an unusual move, Judge Williams also arranged for the courthouse to display an exhibition on the history of the American justice system, including both its achievements and its historical struggles with racial equality. The exhibition was set up in the courthouse lobby, where Peterson would have to pass it every time he came to court. During preliminary motions, Peterson's behavior began to show subtle changes. While still hostile, he seemed less certain in his accusations. The judge's calm, methodical approach to addressing his concerns had left him without his expected target for anger. His attorney noticed that he started paying more attention to the actual legal proceedings instead of focusing solely on the judge's race. One particularly notable moment came during a pretrial hearing. When Peterson began to interrupt proceedings with another racist comment, Judge Williams calmly asked him, "Mr. Peterson, could you explain exactly how my actions in this case so far have demonstrated bias against you?" Peterson opened his mouth to respond but found himself unable to cite a single example. The courtroom watched as he struggled to justify his prejudice in the face of clear evidence of fairness. For the first time, he appeared embarrassed rather than angry. Judge Williams's approach began attracting attention from legal scholars. Several law schools requested permission to use the case as a teaching example of how to handle racial bias in the courtroom. The judge agreed, allowing law students to observe the proceedings as part of their education. As the case moved closer to trial, Judge Williams maintained his strategy of extreme transparency. Every decision was thoroughly explained, every procedure carefully documented. He even took the unusual step of providing written explanations for each of his rulings on pretrial motions, making his reasoning clear in public. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, found herself admiring the judge's handling of the situation. "He's turned what could have been a circus into a master class in judicial integrity," she commented to a colleague. By the end of the pretrial phase, Judge Williams had created an environment where Peterson's racist allegations seemed increasingly out of place and irrational. Without ever directly confronting or punishing Peterson for his prejudice, the judge had systematically dismantled the foundation of his bias through pure professionalism and transparency. The stage was now set for the trial itself, with everyone wondering how Peterson would behave under these circumstances. The judge's response to racism had become a story in itself, overshadowing even the original crime in the public's interest. The trial of James Peterson began on a crisp autumn morning, with the courthouse steps crowded with media representatives and spectators. Inside courtroom 304, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation as Judge Marcus Williams called the court to order. The jury, carefully selected through the transparent process Judge Williams had established, consisted of 6 white members, 4 African Americans, and 2 Asian Americans. They sat quietly, notebooks ready, as Sarah Chen rose to deliver her opening statement. Linda Martinez, Peterson's defense attorney, faced an uphill battle. Her opening statement focused on Peterson's state of mind, suggesting that alcohol and personal problems had influenced his actions. Peterson, sitting at the defense table in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, seemed to shrink into himself as the evidence mounted. The prosecution's first witness was Sarah Jackson, who described the terror of that morning with quiet dignity. As she spoke about rushing her children back into the house, Peterson unexpectedly broke down. For the first time, he seemed to realize the human impact of his actions. Judge Williams called a brief recess to allow everyone to regain their composure. Throughout the trial, Judge Williams maintained his policy of explaining every decision in detail. When Peterson's attorney objected to certain evidence, the judge would carefully outline his reasoning for either sustaining or overruling the objection. This transparency seemed to have an effect on Peterson, who began paying close attention to the legal arguments. The prosecution's case was strong. Multiple neighbors testified about Peterson's history of racist comments. Police officers described finding racist literature in his home during the investigation. The evidence technician presented detailed analysis of the property damage, including cost estimates for repairs. A turning point came when Michael Jackson took the stand. Instead of expressing anger, he spoke about his hope that Peterson would someday understand that hate only harmed himself. As Michael described his children's continuing nightmares, Peterson was seen wiping his eyes. The defense tried to argue that Peterson's actions, while wrong, didn't rise to the level of a hate crime. However, Peterson's own recorded statements from the police body cameras made this argument difficult to maintain. The jury's expressions during this testimony suggested they weren't convinced by the defense's position. Halfway through the trial, an unexpected moment occurred. During a lunch break, Peterson was overheard asking his attorney why Judge Williams was being so fair to him. This comment, reported by a courthouse deputy, suggested that Peterson's worldview was beginning to crack. The prosecution's expert witness, a psychologist specializing in hate crimes, explained how deeply racial bias can affect perception. She noted that often, people like Peterson expect unfair treatment from those they're prejudiced against, and when they receive fairness instead, it challenges their entire belief system. As the trial progressed, the independent observers appointed by Judge Williams noted in their reports that the proceedings were being conducted with exceptional fairness. They particularly praised the judge's handling of sensitive testimony and his careful instructions to the jury about considering only the evidence, not personal beliefs or prejudices. The defense's case was brief. Their main argument centered on Peterson's difficult childhood and his struggles with alcohol. However, under cross-examination, the witnesses often ended up strengthening the prosecution's case by revealing more about Peterson's history of racist behavior. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Williams maintained his calm, professional demeanor. When Peterson would occasionally show signs of his former hostility, the judge would simply ask him to explain his concerns specifically, which usually resulted in Peterson falling silent. The trial's most powerful moment came during the presentation of the security camera footage showing the Jackson children's fear as they fled into their house. Several jurors were seen wiping away tears, and even Peterson turned away from the screen, unable to watch his own actions. As the trial neared its end, the transformation in Peterson was noticeable. The angry, defiant man who had demanded a different judge was now subdued, often appearing lost in thought. His racist outbursts had ceased entirely, replaced by a quiet attentiveness to the proceedings. The closing arguments approached, with both sides preparing to make their final presentations to the jury. The courthouse buzzed with speculation about the verdict, but everyone agreed on one thing: regardless of the outcome, Judge Williams had turned a potentially explosive situation into a powerful lesson about justice and fairness. The closing arguments began on a Thursday morning, with tension filling every corner of the courtroom. Sarah Chen, the prosecutor, stood before the jury looking confident yet solemn. Her closing argument lasted exactly 1 hour, during which she methodically reviewed the mountain of evidence against James Peterson. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Chen began, her voice clear and measured, "over the past 2 weeks, you've seen video footage, heard from witnesses, and examined physical evidence that tells an undeniable story of hate and violence. She proceeded to play short clips from the security cameras one final time, letting Peterson's actions and words speak for themselves. Linda Martinez, Peterson's defense attorney, faced a challenging task in her closing argument. She focused on reminding the jury that Judge Williams's instructions to the jury were detailed and clear. He spent 45 minutes explaining the legal requirements for each charge, the meaning of reasonable doubt, and the importance of setting aside personal biases. His careful attention to detail meant that no one could question whether Peterson had received a fair trial. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, Peterson sat quietly, staring at his hands. The transformation in his demeanor from the trial's beginning was striking. Gone was the belligerent man who had demanded a different judge. In his place sat someone who seemed to be grappling with the reality of his actions for the first time. The jury's deliberation was shorter than anyone expected. After just 4 hours, they signaled they had reached a verdict. As people rushed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere grew electric with anticipation. The Jackson family sat in the front row, holding hands. Behind them, the courtroom was packed with media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public. Judge Williams called the court to order, his voice steady as always. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked the foreperson, a middle-aged white woman who worked as a school teacher. "We have, Your Honor," she responded, her voice slightly trembling. The clerk read the verdict forms. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of vandalism. Guilty of making terrorist threats. Guilty of hate crimes. Guilty of attempted assault. The jury had rejected every one of the defense's arguments. As each guilty was read, Peterson's shoulders slumped further. When the final count was announced, he buried his face in his hands. His attorney placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. Judge Williams polled each juror individually, asking if this was their true verdict. Each responded with a firm yes. The process took several minutes, with the judge ensuring that every legal requirement was meticulously followed. After the verdict was recorded, Judge Williams addressed the courtroom. "I want to thank the jury for their service and attention to this difficult case," he said. "They have performed their civic duty with remarkable diligence and care." The Jackson family remained composed as the verdict was read, though Sarah Jackson wiped away a few tears. Michael Jackson simply nodded, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Their dignity throughout the trial had made a strong impression on everyone in the courtroom. As the jury was dismissed, Peterson did something unexpected. He asked his attorney if he could address the court. After a brief consultation with both lawyers, Judge Williams allowed it. Standing shakily, Peterson spoke in a voice very different from his earlier outbursts. I want to say something," he began, his voice barely audible. "Watching myself on those videos, seeing what I did. I don't." He paused, struggling to find words. "I don't recognize that person anymore." Judge Williams listened attentively, his expression neutral but attentive. When Peterson finished, the judge thanked him for his statement and announced that sentencing would be scheduled for 2 weeks later, allowing time for the preparation of pre-sentencing reports. As the courtroom began to empty, reporters rushed to file their stories. Legal observers were already discussing how this case would be studied in law schools as an example of how to handle racial bias in the courtroom. The verdict marked not just the end of the trial, but also a significant moment in the local community's history. It demonstrated that justice could be served without perpetuating the cycle of hatred that had sparked the crime in the first place. Peterson was led away by deputies, no longer shouting or resistant, but appearing deep in thought. The transformation that had begun during the trial seemed to be continuing, though what its final result would be remained to be seen. The sentencing phase would reveal whether this change was genuine or merely a response to his conviction. 2 weeks after the verdict, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity for James Peterson's sentencing hearing. Legal experts had predicted Judge Marcus Williams would impose the maximum sentence, given the nature of the crimes and Peterson's initial behavior in court. The morning began with victim impact statements. Sarah Jackson spoke first, describing how her children still had nightmares and feared going outside. Her voice trembled as she explained how their sense of safety had been shattered. However, what she said next surprised everyone. "Despite everything Mr. Peterson did to our family," she said, looking directly at him, We don't want revenge. We want healing, not just for us, but for him too. Peterson, dressed in his orange jumpsuit, lifted his head and met her gaze for the first time since the trial began. Michael Jackson spoke next, echoing his wife's sentiments. He described how their children had asked why someone would hate them because of their skin color. The hardest thing, he said, was explaining to our kids that this kind of hatred still exists. But we also told them that people can change. When it was Peterson's turn to speak, he stood slowly. Gone was the angry man who had demanded a white judge. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've had a lot of time to think," he began. "Watching those videos of myself, seeing what I did to those children." He paused, wiping his eyes. "I don't know how to fix what I broke, but I want to try." The prosecution recommended the maximum sentence, 15 years in prison plus hefty fines. They'd argued that the community needed to see that hate crimes would be severely punished. The defense asked for leniency, citing Peterson's recent change in attitude and his potential for rehabilitation. Judge Williams sat quietly throughout these presentations, occasionally making notes. When everyone had finished speaking, he removed his glasses and looked directly at Peterson. "Mr. Peterson," he began, "your crimes were serious and caused deep harm to not just the Jackson family, but to our entire community." The judge paused, looking down at his notes. "However, I've been watching you throughout this trial. I've seen something that gives me hope." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Williams revealed his sentence. Peterson would serve 5 years in prison, but with an unprecedented condition. You would be required to spend 3 hours every weekend working at the African American History Museum under supervision. Additionally, the judge continued, "You will take courses in African American history and cultural sensitivity while in prison. Upon release, you will participate in racial reconciliation programs and share your story with others as a warning about the consequences of hate." The sentence caused immediate murmuring in the courtroom. Some observers were shocked by what seemed like leniency, while others recognized the innovative nature of the rehabilitation plan. Judge Williams raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Peterson, I'm not giving you a lighter sentence because I excuse your actions. I'm doing this because I believe education and exposure are more effective at changing hearts than pure punishment. You will still face serious consequences for your crimes, but you'll also have the opportunity to learn and grow." Peterson stood motionless, tears running down his face. "Thank you, Your Honor," he whispered. "I don't deserve this chance." "No one deserves hatred, Mr. Peterson," the judge replied. "Not the Jacksons, and not you. This sentence is about breaking the cycle of hate, not perpetuating it." The Jackson family nodded in approval from their seats. Sarah Jackson was seen wiping away tears, while Michael held their children close. The younger Jackson child whispered something to his father, who smiled and nodded. As the proceedings concluded, Judge Williams added one final condition. Peterson would have to write monthly reflection essays about what he was learning from his museum work and his studies. These essays would become part of his rehabilitation record. The sentence made national headlines, with legal experts debating its merits on news programs across the country. Some criticized it as too lenient, while others praised its innovative approach to addressing racial hatred through education and exposure rather than just punishment. The African American History Museum's director, Dr. Angela Robinson, told reporters she initially had reservations about the sentence but saw its potential for creating real change. "Sometimes," she said, "the people who need to learn our history the most are the ones who fought against it the hardest." As Peterson was led away to begin his sentence, he turned one last time toward Judge Williams. The look they exchanged spoke volumes about the transformation that had already begun and the hope for what was yet to come. 1 year after Judge Marcus Williams's unprecedented sentencing decision, the impact of the Peterson case continued to ripple through the community and beyond. The story had evolved from a simple hate crime case into something far more significant, a powerful example of transformative justice. James Peterson's first few months in prison were challenging. Some inmates targeted him because of his crimes, while others mocked his required studies. However, as he immersed himself in African American history courses, something began to change. His monthly reflection essays, initially brief and superficial, grew more thoughtful and introspective. Judge Williams's innovative sentence attracted attention from legal reformers nationwide. 3 other states began implementing similar programs, combining traditional punishment with educational rehabilitation for hate crime offenders. Law schools added the case to their curriculum, using it to discuss alternative approaches to justice. Local media followed up on the case with a special report titled Justice and Transformation. They interviewed Peterson through the prison's video system. His appearance had changed. He looked older, more thoughtful, and his eyes carried the weight of genuine remorse. "I was blind," Peterson told the interviewer, his voice steady. "I thought Judge Williams would be unfair because of his race, but he showed me more fairness than I deserved. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in others: humanity." The African American History Museum reported an unexpected benefit. Attendance increased as people came to learn about the program. Some visitors specifically requested to attend during Peterson's work hours, curious to see this unique form of rehabilitation in action. The museum developed a special program called Breaking the Cycle, which used Peterson's case as a starting point for discussions about racism and redemption. Sarah Jackson published a powerful essay in the local newspaper about forgiveness and healing. She wrote about her children's questions, their fears, and their gradual understanding of both justice and mercy. Her words resonated with readers across the country, leading to speaking engagements at schools and community centers. Peterson's reflection essays were compiled into a teaching resource, with his permission. Teachers began using them in social studies classes to discuss racism, consequences, and the possibility of change. Students wrote their own responses, many expressing surprise at how their perspectives shifted after reading Peterson's journey. Judge Williams received both criticism and praise for his decision. Some argued he had been too lenient, while others celebrated his innovative approach. When asked about it at a judicial conference, he simply said, "Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation." Sometimes the hardest sentences to deliver are the ones that offer hope. The case sparked important conversations about the role of the justice system in addressing racial hatred. Legal scholars debated whether traditional punitive measures were effective in changing deeply held prejudices. Peterson's visible transformation became a powerful argument for alternative approaches. By the end of the first year, Peterson had completed hundreds of hours at the museum. His knowledge of African American history had grown exponentially, and more importantly, his understanding of human dignity had fundamentally shifted. He requested permission to start a study group in prison, helping other inmates learn about racial justice and history. The local community, initially divided over the sentence, began to see its wisdom. The incident that had threatened to tear the community apart had instead become a catalyst for healing and understanding. Other judges started consulting with Judge Williams about implementing similar programs in their jurisdictions. As the year drew to a close, Dr. Robinson organized a special museum exhibit titled The Journey to Understanding, featuring photographs and stories of transformation from various perspectives. The centerpiece was a joint statement written by both the Jackson family and Peterson, describing their parallel journeys of healing and growth. The case's legacy extended far beyond its original scope. It demonstrated that justice could be both firm and compassionate, that hatred could be answered with wisdom rather than vengeance, and that even the deepest prejudices could be transformed through education and exposure to truth. Judge Williams's chambers received hundreds of letters from around the country, many from other judges seeking advice on implementing similar programs. His response was always the same: justice served with dignity has the power to transform both the guilty and the wronged. Sometimes the most powerful sentence is one that makes room for change. On a quiet Tuesday morning in Atlanta, Georgia, the peaceful neighborhood of Pine Hills was disrupted by the sound of police sirens. James Peterson, a 45-year-old construction worker known in the area for his controversial views, had finally crossed a line that would change many lives forever. The Jackson family had lived in Pine Hills for over a decade. Michael Jackson, a successful business owner, his wife Sarah, a kindergarten teacher, and their 2 children had always been respected members of the community. What happened next was captured in crystal clear detail by the Jacksons' recently installed security system. Peterson, wearing a white tank top and jeans, crossed the street with a can of spray paint in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. The security footage showed him violently swinging the bat at the Jacksons' car, shattering the windows and leaving deep dents in the doors. He then proceeded to spray paint racist messages across their garage door and front porch. Michael Jackson, who had immediately left work after his wife's call, arrived just as Peterson was finishing his vandalism. When Michael stepped out of his car to confront him, Peterson charged at him with the bat raised. Fortunately, 2 police cars arrived at that exact moment, responding to calls from concerned neighbors who had witnessed the commotion. Officer Maria Rodriguez and her partner quickly subdued Peterson, who continued to shout racial slurs and threats even as they handcuffed him. The entire arrest was recorded on police body cameras, capturing every hateful word and aggressive action. Peterson's behavior was so extreme that even veteran officers were shocked by the intensity of his racism. At the police station, Peterson showed no remorse. During questioning, he proudly admitted to his actions, declaring that he had been planning this for weeks. His criminal record revealed previous incidents of racial harassment, but nothing as severe as this physical attack and property damage. The district attorney's office took special interest in the case, given the clear hate crime elements and the overwhelming evidence. Security footage, police body cameras, multiple witness statements, and Peterson's own admission made it one of the strongest cases they had seen in years. The Jackson family, despite their traumatic experience, handled the situation with remarkable dignity. In interviews with police, Sarah Jackson expressed concern not just for her family's safety, but for the community as a whole. "This kind of hatred affects everyone," she told the officers. "It's not just about us anymore." The local media quickly picked up the story, and within days, it had caught the attention of national news networks. The security camera footage, showing Peterson's rampage in broad daylight, was particularly shocking to viewers across the country. It sparked conversations about ongoing racial tensions in seemingly peaceful communities. Community response was swift and supportive. Neighbors organized a cleanup effort to remove the racist graffiti from the Jacksons' home. Local businesses donated materials to repair their car, and a fundraiser to install additional security measures exceeded its goal within hours. Peterson, meanwhile, remained in custody, denied bail due to the violent nature of his actions and his unrepentant attitude. His employer quickly terminated his position, and his own family members publicly distanced themselves from him, issuing a statement condemning his actions. The case was assigned to the Criminal Division of the Atlanta Superior Court, where it would soon take an unexpected turn that no one could have anticipated. The prosecution prepared a solid case, gathering additional evidence of Peterson's history of racial harassment and documenting the full extent of damage to the Jacksons' property. As the preliminary hearing approached, Peterson's court-appointed attorney advised him to consider a plea deal given the overwhelming evidence against him. However, Peterson refused, insisting on taking the case to trial. His decision would lead to a series of events that would not only shock the legal community, but would also become a powerful lesson about justice, dignity, and the possibility of change. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked about cases in recent Georgia history, though no one yet knew just how remarkable the outcome would be. As Peterson sat in his cell, still defiant and unrepentant, the wheels of justice began turning in a direction that would surprise everyone involved.